It is Marie here from the Quarantine Diaries. Today is day 30 today, Friday the 24th of April. And how are you all today? Sorry, I'm a little bit disorganized this morning because I was going to talk about one thing and then I changed my mind and talked about another. And as you can see, I haven't really got myself organized in terms of getting my hair done properly or anything nice like that. But today it was actually, we'd caught up. Have you guys, hopefully you caught up with the chat that I had with Libby Johnson yesterday, aka Trudy Myrtle. We had a wonderful chat yesterday about some of her quintessential patterns, primarily timely and floozy, and making decisions around yarn selection for those and sizing, and using those patterns as a template that can hive you off in a whole bunch of other directions. And the yarn selection and actually thinking about all of those sorts of little elements and swatching and so many of those sort of things. Oh no, oh yeah, I know. It's Delene's just saying sometimes the notification doesn't turn up until a little while after I start. I know. I don't know why that is. The tech. Anywho, and we were sort of talking about that. And one of the things that I've had on my list to talk about for a wee while, and I spoke about it ages ago in one of my skeins pieces last year. And I thought actually I could revisit this again because so many of you wouldn't have seen that. And there's so many more new people. And I think it's something, and someone else actually did mention it in the questions the other day. And Libby sort of touched on it when she was saying about thinking about yarns that we select for different projects and garments. And one of the things, there's so many different factors to consider, but I thought I would touch on one of those factors today. And it comes because I've been answering a lot of inquiries over the last few days, and I've been thinking, and these inquiries have got me thinking. And one of the ones actually had this question 3 times in the last week. And often this question comes from people who have just come back to knitting or haven't knit for a long time. And the landscape that we live in has changed quite a bit from possibly when they were knitting last knit sort of 10, 20, in some case 30 years ago to today. And that question is, can I please have a yarn that is really lovely and soft to wear, but I don't want a yarn that pills? And pilling is one of those really interesting elements around hand knitted or handcrafted garments or projects or things that we have in our industry. And I thought I would talk a little bit today about pilling and just some of the things that, if pilling is an issue for you, or just talking about pilling in general. And I look at pilling a little bit like income tax. It is one of those things that you can't necessarily avoid. It is always going to be there. But if you actually put a little bit of thought or planning into it, you can actually do a lot of things to mitigate it. And pilling is very like that. So I thought I have literally, honestly, dug through the Marie archive and wardrobe and pulled together a series of examples that hopefully will help get your head around what pilling is, what creates pilling, what causes pilling, how to work around it, how to mitigate it, how to actually accept it and understand it for what it actually is. So that's what I thought I would talk about today. So hopefully this goes okay, because I've got a whole heap of garments here and a whole heap of yarns. And what I'm saying is just what I'm going to talk about comes from 2 places. One, my knowledge of the yarn construction and yarn product development, because that is a large part of what I do in my day-to-day job. And a large part of this is also just through pure experience, as being a hand knitter for a long time, knitting a prolific amount of garments, and actually then caring and looking after them accordingly. So you may or may not agree with some of the stuff that I have to say, but these are, my personal experiences. If you have any questions, do feel free to pop them in the comments. So that would be great. So do that. I'd love to hear what you have to say. Right. So pilling. What is pilling? So pilling is and let's find one that has got one. There we go. There's a good one right on the top there. Pilling is, and I don't know whether you can see it with that, is the little sort of bubbly bits that you get on a yarn. And a pill is essentially created, and I'll just pluck one off. There it is. A pill is essentially created, here we go, when you combine two factors, fibre plus friction. And what happens is you apply friction to a fibre, and it doesn't matter whether it's store-bought or handmade or hand-knitted, but whenever you apply friction to a fibre, you're actually rubbing and encouraging that fibre to actually release from the yarn or the fabric that it's created in. Why is it then that we see more proliferation of pilling, particularly in handcrafted garments? And one of the reasons for that is that commercially made garments, particularly if we're looking at clothing, when you actually look at your clothing, the large majority of it, particularly if it has been made in a commercial process, you'll probably find that it's an incredibly finely, tightly woven or knitted fabric that is made from a very, very small yarn or thread, which then has a high element of twist on it to create a beautiful smooth fabric. And in doing so, that fabric in itself wears very, very well. So that's, whereas when we're hand knitting, it's very rare that you'll find us hand knitting on incredibly fine needles or crocheting on incredibly, incredibly fine hooks to create a fabric that is that light and that fine. So that is why we often see it in our hand produced garments, because we're actually dealing with a much bigger gauge. So what I thought I would do is I would start off with just, I'm going to primarily talk about it in a garment sense, and then actually look at the construction of a yarn. And actually when it comes to doing yarn selection for a project, if pilling is one of the main elements that you have in mind that you want to avoid, these are some of the things that you can do to do it. So I've gone and put on, I've got my Arfie sweater on today, and I went mad trying to find I have got a scrap of Arfie yarn here somewhere, and I can't find it to show you. But primarily where you're going to get pilling is here under the arms. For some women, it's here underneath the girls, underneath the bust line. And then for me particularly, because I work primarily in a desk job, I get a lot of pilling across the lower part of the back. So those are the main problem areas. The number one main problem area, let's face it though, is here underneath the arms, because let's face it, your arms are doing this all the time. You've got fabric rubbing on fabric, and you're going to get that friction there. It is just completely unavoidable. So those are in a garment setting. When it comes to shawls or scarves like this, or gloves can actually be prone to pilling, and often it will be, again, prone to the areas where you've got a lot of friction. So that will be between the joints of fingers or along the palms. And obviously in slippers, you tend to get not only a pilling, but a pilling and a felting effect as you're moving across the bottom of the floor. So how do we tackle that? How do we look at it, and where do you go? So one of the first things I'd talk about is you need to look at your yarn. And there are so many different yarns out there. So the question I've received several times is, can I have a yarn that is very soft, but it doesn't pill? So when it comes to yarn, I look at that to me is a yin-yang question. So when we've got yarns and we're making and selecting yarns, I find there are two main elements with a fibre, and I'm talking about animal fibres here. I'm not going to dive into plant-based fibres because I'm not such an expert in that area, but I certainly know a lot about animal fibres. When we spin in a worsted spun process, we're a long fibre process. So our average length of a piece of wool is around that. That's an ideal. In fact, that's probably a weeny bit longer, probably more like that. That's the sort of length that we're looking at. So then we have a whole bunch of those fibres all lined up. And then what we do is we add twist to them. It's fairly straightforward, isn't it? So you have a nice long fibre that you add twist. Now, when you start creeping into fibres like wool, as we've now learnt, no two wools are made the same, right? And there's a thing called the micron. We use microns in the micron count. So what you have is with the micron count, you will have very fine microns. And from our perspective, we will start doing things from around 17 micron all the way up to about 32 micron. And just so you're aware, I'm just... Right. I know. Maybe I was a frustrated teacher in another life. Right, so these are your micron counts. You have it running from, we use in our process, and this is just talking about wool, and alpaca is graded similarly, but this is sheep's wool. So we basically work from 17 micron all the way up to 32 micron. So the smaller the number, the thinner the yarn, because what they're actually measuring is the thickness of that actual fiber. So if the fiber is a really super fine, lovely merino, and merino I think has been measured down as low as I think 12 micron, is very, very fine. What you tend to find is the stuff that sits actually between 14 and 17 micron, which a lot of very premium, high-end, high country New Zealand merino sits, and that's the stuff that our New Zealand merino reputation is built on. That is the stuff that goes primarily off to places like Italy for high-end suiting and things like that. Utterly gloriously beautiful. For hand knitting, we do work from 17 microns. So white gum wool, which I did pull out a swatch, which you may have seen, white gum wool. A lot of the fibre that we pull from them, theirs is consistently around the 17 micron mark, all the way through up to 32 micron over here. Now, for us, most merinos run to, that tends to be the merino gap that we work on, 17 to 22 microns. Then we have what we call a mid-micron area, so that runs from about 22 to 28 microns. And just to give you an idea, where are we? Here, in this little playground here. So you're playing around with, so you're starting with here at this end, merino soft, and then you're sort of moving this whole portion through the middle here. That is your, what lives in there? Vintage lives in there. And what else lives in there? Urban Deluxe lives in there. Perrindale lives in there. A whole heap live in that centre portion. And most of those, you'll often find that we'll have blends of different yarns, whether it's Chatswood lives in there. There's a whole in that mid-micron group. And then at the coarser end, so that coarser end at the top, this end up here, that's your Southlanders. Perrindale's actually on this cusp point here, but you've got Southlander, Cozy, Snug, all of those are at that higher end up there, right? So, and you know that from the handle of the yarn. I mean, we've all done it. We touch and we feel and we squish. And you know the stuff down here that feels super soft is quite different from the stuff all the way up here that feels super coarse. So the difference between the fibre up here to the fibre down here is this fibre up here is essentially twice as thick as this fibre down here. You following me so far? And that's simply all it is. It's just the thickness of the fibre. Doesn't necessarily mean that the fibre is any different, but it's just the thickness of it. And because it's thicker, and it's like hair, isn't it? We already know what our hair is like when it's actually very, very fine and very, very soft, and it drives you crazy and you can't style it and you can't do anything with it. And you'll often find it as finer or fairer hairs that are like that. Whereas if you actually have dark or red hairs, red heads, we're classic for it, you actually have thicker and coarser hair. So therefore, you're actually able to, it's easier to style and you can do different things with it and you can play around. Well, yarn and fibre is exactly the same. So what does this mean for pilling? Well, it's quite simple. In terms of pilling, it is like this. The finer things are, the more pilling you have, and the coarser things are, the less pilling you have. And the reason for that purely is because those fibres, when you pull them all together into a strand of yarn, so if you've got a DK yarn, right, and this is your DK yarn, and you've got, this is a DK yarn, and that is a really fine micron yarn. So it's a silver lining yarn. That would be a great example. Silver lining on average was around 19-ish microns, thereabout. So you've got this beautiful silver lining yarn, and it's all made with multiple fibres in there. Because it's around 18 micron, to make that single strand, you have got way more single fibres of that merino in that single DK strand to make that yarn, because it's finer, right? And we've got a count of the thickness of the yarn. So to get the thickness of the yarn, we need to jab in more fibres in there. Conversely, if you're doing a Southlander yarn, being a DK, and that's nearly almost, not quite, but nearly double, so about 80% to what the silver lining is, you do not have to jam in quite so many fibers to get the same thickness of yarn. So when you're dealing with a lot less fibers, when it comes to friction and you're rubbing this, it's much, much easier for fibers to escape when you've got more of them jammed into a space and create a pill than what it is here. So this is, I hope this is not boring you to tears, but this essentially is fiber softness is one of the main contributors into what will pill and what won't pill. And I'm going to show you some examples because I think you've had enough of that just for the minute. So some really, really good examples of that. And let's start with silver lining, because this is one, I know that this was one of the things that we got back a lot from people around this yarn. And they would say to us, oh, we just love that yarn. We just love it. We love it. We love the feeling of it. Oh, but it pills. It pills really dreadfully. Yeah, it does pill. But it's actually a really easy yarn to manage in terms of its pilling, which is why when we manufactured the DK yarn, it was a 4-fold twist. So we then created 4 fine strands, and I'm going to unravel this because it's a common count yarn. And what a common count yarn is when we spin a single, which is the single strand, and we take that single strand, and that single strand is then used across multiple thicknesses. Southland is a really good example of this. Southlander is a common count yarn. So let me just unravel it. There we go. So with silver lining, and I'm going to show you this with Southlander too. So with silver lining, there you go. We had a single count. So this beautiful single yarn. And to make our Lumiere, which is our finer version of silver lining, we just spun together the 2 strands together. What we did do is, because we knew that this was so fine, what we did do is we actually put, as you can see, a reasonably high angle of twist on that. Okay, and what I mean by high angle of twist, and I'm going to show you using this one as an example. This is a yarn which, you see that better? No, actually, you'll see it better on this one. I've got so many examples here. I've been diving through my stash. Yes, because this is actually much more closely related. So as you can see, we've got a higher angle of twist on that. On this one here, this is more slack twisted. See that? So the angle of twist on this is nowhere near as high, and it's very easy to unravel. And this is actually a much coarser yarn. So to be honest with you, the slacker twist on this is just fine, because the fibre itself will be really, really long and we'll be able to tolerate it. So we put a higher angle of twist on there in order to try, and these are the little tricks that we as a spinner, that we do to try and hold these fibres in. And if I sort of take that silver lining like that and just sort of start doing it, you can already, there, look, you can already start seeing how it starts wanting to escape from its prison. Because what holds fibres in place are essentially twist. In a worsted process, twist. Twist can be your enemy and twist can be your friend. And when it comes to pilling, twist is your friend. So when it comes to this silver lining yarn like this, the reality of it is we've put a little bit of higher angle of twist in here, but it's only been 2 singles twisted upon each other. So when it comes to a knitted garment, and here's one I have just finished. I've finished this at the beginning of lockdown. Right. At the moment, because this has just been blocked, it's not had anything else to it, you can see it is this stunningly beautiful, lovely fabric. When this starts getting worn, and with babies, it always happens actually on the back. And the reason for that, of course, is babies are always on their back and they're wriggling around. You will start, ultimately, probably after 2 or 3 wears, the beginning of some pilling will actually appear on a garment like this. Now, the first thing, if that happens, the first thing you do is you don't jump up and down and go to social media and yell and scream and say that this is the end of the world. It is perfectly normal. especially on fine merino garments, which is what we tend to put our babies in, finer fibre garments. That's quite normal. It is really, really simple to rectify. Particularly on a garment like this that hasn't been treated. When I go through the way she can actually remove pilling, garments like this to depill are the easiest things in the world to do. And when you've actually got something like this that has been handmade with love, with an absolutely stunningly beautiful fibre, spending 2 minutes on giving it a little bit of a zhuzh up to have it looking good, it's not the end of the world, is it? If you're actually just got this garment that's pilled at the back and it's going to be popped on a baby and it's going to be worn at home, you know what? I don't think the baby's really going to care. Not struck a complaining baby yet because they haven't, they've been a bit concerned about popping out in the capsule or actually, mooching around in the bassinet and that garment, she's not looking tip-top, ship shape. They don't care. So don't, I know you care, but I mean, if you're just rocking around at home, it's not going to affect the garment anymore. It's not going to affect the baby. It's not going to affect it. It is just there. All right. So don't panic about that. So that is thing number one. So twist is hugely important. So then that brings me on to what about yarns that don't actually have a lot of twist? And I know for a while there, a lot of designers, especially last year, through the last couple of years, you noticed that there were a lot of projects that were out there using single roving yarns. And I have a love-hate relationship with single roving yarns. So what a single roving yarn is, and this is the best example, is my Noro. Let's face it, we've all seen this from me, haven't we, over the last month? So this is my Noro. This is a single roving yarn. Okay? Now, interestingly enough about this yarn is this is made from a mixture of recycled silk, which is mostly obtained from garments, and wool. And this is the really interesting thing that these guys do, that Noro do with this sort of yarn, is that you've got a combination. Silk is actually generally, as a rule, a very, very fine but very long fibre. They've done this in a recycled process, in a woolen spun process, which, as I've explained before, is shorter fibres cross-linked together. But by adding the wool into this, and they also add, for a woolen spun yarn, a surprising amount of twist onto this yarn. So they understand that they're dealing with a yarn that has got one fibre which is very long, another fibre that is potentially very short, but in a process that actually makes the fibres shorter than normal. So what they've gone and done is to actually mitigate some of the issues with both the construction and the wear of the yarn, they've actually put a reasonable amount of twist on here to keep those little figures where they need to be, keep those fibres where they need to be. So the wear on this is surprisingly good. But also too, for anybody that's actually felt this yarn, knowing the silk content that's in there, you think, not very soft. And it isn't. It isn't very soft. But that's okay, because I mean, if you're like me, I don't buy this for its softness. I buy this for the absolutely unbelievable colours that you get, and the texture of the yarn, and the interest of the yarn, and the fact that I can add it to a garment and it becomes this incredible feature. So for me, softness is not an issue. So that's how they get around it. Then at the other end of the spectrum, you get yarns like this. I couldn't believe it. I'm going to tell you, I bought this in 2012. This is another one of Marie's travel yarns. I bought this in Chicago when I was there in 2012 with my other job, Another Life. Yes, I do have one of those as well. I actually have, I won't bore you with the details of my other business, which has got nothing to do with yarn whatsoever. Completely different business. Anywho, I was in Chicago with that business and went to a yarn shop and I bought this. And this is a single roving. Now this is incredibly soft. This is like soft. Amazing. Amazing. I forgot I had it. Absolutely forgot I had it. 50-50 wool silk. Yes, I know. When it comes to silk, I'm a silk magpie. If you had to, I mean, wool is still my number one favourite because, of the versatility, you can do so much with it. But if you said to me, Marie, what is your number one luxury fibre? For me, it's silk every time. Now, this yarn is really fascinating, and you can even see it just at the top of the camera. If I pull it back, can you see that? See, even on the skein, there's a bit of fluffing there. Those fibres are starting to escape. This is a single woven yarn, and this is the sort of yarn that has been incredibly popular with a lot of smaller independent firms in recent years. It is utterly, and justifiably so. It is a beautiful yarn. And whether it be silk or just merino or cashmere or alpaca, the construction of the yarn generally is similar. You have this beautiful fine single roving, and you just can't help but fall in love with it. It's what they call a fingering weight, so sort of 4-ply weight. And this is a yarn that you just adore. And there have been a lot of designs around incorporating these sorts of yarns. Now, the one thing I have struck with people is if you've actually made something of these, I don't mind designs in these yarns at all. Now, what I find with these yarns is that if they're in a shawl or a wrap, that's where these yarns work fantastically well, because in a shawl or a wrap, you aren't necessarily putting yourself in those high friction areas. You're wearing it up around your neck, maybe up around your shoulders, but you don't spend all your time rubbing your shoulders against other bits of friction, do you? So shawls and wraps are really, really good for delicate yarns because you're never putting them in a situation where they can come into harm's way to pill, right? So, if you've got those really special luxury fibers, a really good way to use them is in those sorts of projects. However, I have seen a number of projects out there, particularly using very light sort of crop tops or shells or bolero style jackets, using a couple of skeins of these. They will put it in a gauge that's quite loose in order to be able to essentially get the meterage with, say, only 2 of these skeins to be able to create a garment. And you say to yourself, well, why do they do that? What is the reason for that, Marie? I'll tell you. The reason that they do that is often a skein like this, and has this one still got a price on it? Does it have a price on it? No, it doesn't. I can tell you this one was somewhere in the vicinity of around $35 back in 2012. It was not an inexpensive skein of yarn by any stretch of the imagination. Expensive. So there are a lot of designs out there that will be particularly garments or little crop tops like that, a garment, where they set themselves a challenge to only use no more than, say, 2 of these, 3 at an absolute push, because it's an investment yarn. They know that you're not going to have somebody knit a me-sized very fine gauged 4-ply cardigan, because it's out of the reach of most people. So they do that. So they create this really beautiful ethereal looking designs using one of these yarns with a very loose gauge. And what's the thing that happens most often? There's several things that happen. One is they pill like a pig, because the other thing that holds those fibers in there, other than this, is twist and gauge. So the looser the gauge that you have in a single woven yarn, you're not actually, giving that yarn or fiber anything to hold on to. So loosely gauged yarns will also be more heavily prone to pilling than ones that actually have a gauge which is recommended for the yarn from a technical element, or one that's even further. So you will definitely see that phenomenon. The other thing too that happens with this looser gauge, and I mean, a gauge conversation is a whole nother broadcast, but is when you've got a looser gauge, particularly with these single woven yarns, how often have you been caught out and you've caught that? You've walked past a doorknob, or you've caught it on the end of a piece of wicker or something that's sticking out from the side of something, and you've pulled it, and it is just, everything just concertinas up, and ends up with this massive big pull. Yeah, that's the other risk that you run when you've got something loose like that. So yeah, definitely something worth doing. Now, I'm just going to jump in here and make sure there's no questions before I start launching on. Oh my God. I know I hope I'm not rambling. I feel like I'm rambling. I feel like I'm really rambling, but I promise I'm not. So I'm going to show you an example in a second. Oh, please, can we see your hand? Why? There you go, Rhonda. Why do you need to see my hands? They're big. I've got big hands. Right. Now Annette is saying hand spinners know what you're talking about in regards to twist and count, but good to hear a manufacturer talking about this problem. Honestly, Annette, it's what rules our life is twist and count, and I'm going to get Peter on here, hopefully, fingers crossed, on Monday to talk about that. So he is twist and count is like the you can do so. It's so funny. Rhonda, she wants to see because they're at the bottom of the screen. Funny. I don't want to see my hands. They're huge. What do I see my hands for? Okay, and I know I just saw someone send me another message because I know this person potentially will be, knowing them, will text me that message. Oh, no, she's just sent me thanks, Susie. She's just sent me a really good idea. Right, okay. Example. So gauge and pulling. So I've just pulled out that single roving, but it goes for plied yarns as well. And why I bring this up, and I'm going to bring this over too, because this is going to be a really good example of that. The reason I bring this up in terms of these designs recently is it's not just, so there was a lot of designs used with these single roving yarns and that sort of element, right? If you were me, for me, these are the sorts of yarns, if I'm going to knit these, I will either do them in a shawl style project, or I will, if I'm doing them in a garment project, I will actually really carefully look at my gauge to best maximize, the wear and use of this yarn. The other thing that you can do with this yarn as well, and this is something that has started to happen, especially in the last 6 to 12 months, is we are now seeing a lot of double stranding of fine weight yarns, particularly with very fine lace weight mohairs. And that is to actually give you this beautiful halo. It's a way of also extending the length of these sorts of yarns, but then adding some extra texture and another dimension by using a wrap spun yarn like a mohair with it. And I love double stranding. I really, really do love the effect that you get. And actually Libby yesterday had her kapua on, and that is a perfect example of that, where she had a very fine weight, lace weight, I think it was, smooth yarn, and then she had a very, very, very fine, I think it was a brushed mohair with it, or alpaca, and it then created a fabric that had this beautiful gentle halo over the top. Now, anything with a halo like that, oh, well, we're going to get onto that in a minute, but that effect is just absolutely stunning. So that are those, but I'm going to show you this. So this is my love note. I have shown this to you guys, and look, this is why I wanted to show this to you. I've probably worn my love note, and I should have pulled this out earlier as an example. I'm careful for the microphone. There's my love note. Look at that. And that's under the arms. Look at those. Can you see them? Like a little colony of ants, isn't it? And that is a fantastic example of how gauge in a garment can affect the wear. This is a 3-folded DK yarn, standard, what we call 495/3. It's standard construction. We see in, this is Cove, sorry, our Cove DK. You see Cove DK, this construction in our Perrindale, you see it in our Southlander, you see it in this, you see it in, oh, what else do we have 495/3 in? Bandit, 495/3. It's like, seriously, it is the Mrs. Brown of very standard count, and it's brilliant because it is the middle of the row count. It is wonderful for everything, and it's a good job. However, the gauge on this yarn, and if you've knitted this, you'll know what I'm talking about. The pattern is actually written primarily, they either had an option where you had a lace weight mohair and a 4-ply or fingering weight yarn that you double stranded together to give you that lovely halo, or they suggested a DK weight yarn knitted to the same gauge. And I think the gauge, someone could correct me if I'm wrong, the gauge from memory is 16 stitches. Now, normally, yes, 16 stitches to 10 centimeters. Now, normally in a DK yarn, you would be knitting that to 22 stitches. All right. So, yes, you do get this really lovely light fabric. And I won't lie, I really enjoy wearing the sweater. I do. And it's lovely to wear. There's 2 things I haven't done. One is I haven't blocked it. And I've done that quite deliberately. And I've done that deliberately because the gauge is so loose that I just know that at the moment I put it on, the positive ease was exactly how I wanted it. I didn't want, it's a very generous garment in ease. I did not want any more ease in there. And I knew that if I blocked this, particularly wet blocked it, I ran the risk of it stretching, particularly widthwise. They don't do it lengthwise, but it'll really stretch widthwise. So didn't want to run that risk. I steamed this. So then that way, particularly for this lace panel at the top, as you can see there, my lace is all sitting nice. Steamed it for my lace, and that was all. But when it has come to its wear, and I'm going to just make sure if you can see, yes, yes you can. So I've already got pilling there under the arms, and I have already got pilling here across the back. Not a huge amount across the back, but a little bit across the back. So that is a really good example of how gauge affects that. I'm going to show you how to get it off. This garment's a really great example of different methods for depilling there. Now, the other way to tackle, particularly if you've got super fine fibres like this, like silk, cashmere, very fine merino, the other way that yarn manufacturers tackle that, and hand spinners as well, because I will show you that example, and I need to dive in here for a yarn to show you. And sorry that this is such a mess because I have literally just dug this out of my cupboard. This is fine merino, silk and cashmere. And the other way as a manufacturer that we deal with potential with pilling and wear, particularly with cashmere, I adore cashmere too. Cashmere is a problem child when it comes to pilling. It's it and merino together. It and cashmere and merino spun together they're a wonderful combination. They're a beautiful partnership. The yarn is amazing, absolutely amazing. When it comes to wearability though, they really are two quite naughty children. So often as a manufacturer, I mean, when we often get those two yarns together, we will often say to contract customers, look, can we add 10% of a fibre like Polworth that doesn't necessarily change the overall effect of the yarn in the slightest, but it's a small amount of that Polworth. This is why Polworth is such a wonderful magic super fibre. The small amount of something like Polworth that's added, usually 10, sometimes even 5% with that longer staple is enough to sort of those fibres will sort of trap all those other fibres in the twisting process and stop them escaping and absconding and becoming, problematic in finished work. The other way you can stop them from escaping is with construction of twist. And this is, and I haven't got my glasses there so I can see what I'm doing. Yes, I do. Hold the phone caller because I am a blind old bat and she needs these sorts of things now. Right. So this one is a really good example. This one is a filatura de Crosa, and the yarn is called Pamir. I don't know whether we had some of this as discontinued. I don't know whether they were discontinued colour or discontinued range. I think the range has been discontinued, which is a pity because the yarn is sublime. Now this is what we call a 444 bar 4 bar 2. This is the same count as our orb and our pearl. This is the reason why we do especially pearl in this construction. So there you go. I've got 4 little tentacles there. Sorry, the camera doesn't show it up too much. Now, each one of those tentacles is made up of 2 more tentacles. Right, so you've actually got, making this yarn, and as I said, orb is exactly the same, and pearl is, there they go. What you have is this very fine single. It's very fine single, which in itself has got quite high twist on it, then twisted back onto itself, and then we've taken 4 of them and twisted them back in themselves, which then creates this beautiful springy cylindrical yarn. I love these yarns, absolutely love them. Wonderful stitch definition. Really, really springy, good bounce. And as you can see, really nice shine because you've got all this twist that gives you this lovely shine. This construction is part of the reason why I chose this construction when I knitted this yarn is because this construction helps keep those pesky little fibers locked away the best that you can, because when you are paying, these are in 25 gram balls, when you are paying, I think full retail, these are about $15 for 25 grams. These are expensive balls of yarn. You want to get the best performance out of that yarn as you possibly can. So this is one of the tricks as a manufacturer that we employ to ensure that the yarn that you get is going to give you good performance over time. And I mean, Pearl is a great example, and I am sure I have some Pearl in my bag of tricks down here. Yes, I do. Yes, I do. Right. And Pearl is another great example of that. And then I'm going to hold up the Pearl. Now, this one is that's a 4-ply. So that's a very fine, in fact, yeah, it is a 4-ply, sport weight actually. This is our DK, exactly the same construction. So obviously, as you can see, it's a thicker yarn. But we've done exactly the same principle. Now, this is a waste blend yarn. There's kitchen sink of fine fibres in this sucker, loads and loads. So what we've got in here is we've got a mixture of both black and white merino, also coloured and non-coloured alpaca. There is silk in here. There's a little bit of mohair in here. Honestly, there are all sorts of things in here. So when you're dealing with a whole bunch of different fibres that are all floating around in there, you never quite know how they're going to play. What you try and do is lock them into a format to actually ensure that they'll perform. And there's also around 10% silk in here. The other reason we actually put it in this format as well is when you actually dye the silk, you get this lovely sort of almost what we call a cross staining, this lovely grainy effect, which I think looks fantastic in this yarn. So that's why we've gone and done that with the Pearl. So when you knit it, let's throw that over there, you get this really beautiful fabric with this outstanding stitch definition. And this is actually a good example because it shows you both like cabled stitching and then lace work in this yarn, but it doesn't make it completely infallible. I adore this cardigan. It's one of my favorites. But as you can see, there is some soft haloing there. There you go, underneath the arms. Probably you can't see it quite so much on the camera, but it is definitely pulling there. And in fact, where this one shows up, funnily enough, there we go, is right at the back there. Can you see that there? And there's definitely some pulling across there. Do you know what? I don't care. I love this cardigan so much because it is so incredibly soft that I will take the time, if I need to, on this one it's about every half dozen wears, I will actually give this a depill because I adore it so much that for me, when you're actually dealing with these sorts of luxury fibres, it comes down to the TLC of those fibres. It's almost like a custodianship. When you're given something that precious, you need to look after it. Why be given something that precious and then treat it like absolute rubbish? I mean, you just wouldn't do it. So for me, when it comes to fibres like this, if you've got them in that precious format, we will try and do our best to actually provide you a yarn that will wear. But when you actually complete your garment, there is going to be a little bit of care involved, right? But what about fibres? You know, are there fibres, Marie, that we can play around with that we're not going to have those issues with? And yes, and some of it actually with these luxury fibres, as I mentioned before, the silk comes down to garment selection. This is another really great example. This is, what is this? Let's turn that around. This is Outlaw Bohemia worsted at the top there. And I love this yarn. As you can see, it's my colours. I'm very colour coordinated. And the one at the bottom is actually, in fact, I've got the cone sitting over there in my office. This is actually an Angora yarn at the bottom here. So it's very, as you can see, it's very, very fluffy and really wonderful. In this shawl, it is perfect. I get this beautiful halo. This is the snuggliest shawl to wear. I love it. What I love about this, it's the first time I ever tried some hand dyed this using food colouring in the microwave, you know, and knit this up with it. And it is so much fun. It's really snuggly. I don't have any issues whatsoever with the Angora and the possum that pilling. Never had to depill that once, because that's the perfect garment for those. If I have a garment, a full garment, and we have garments in Bohemia worsted possum at the shop, yep, possum will escape. But you know what? A little bit simple pilling underneath those problem areas, particularly sweater stones, work really, really well with those possum yarns. A sweater stone for those, I don't have one here. Is it kind of a, you know, the blocks that you get to set doing sanding from the hardware store? They look like one of those, but it's like a synthetic porous pumice, and that just is perfect. And in fact, I have actually at a pinch used a pumice stone. A rougher pumice stone will actually do the trick on something like that. They work incredibly well. But what happens when good yarn like Angora goes bad? What happens when it goes horribly wrong? I can show you. Because believe me, I've got every stuff up known to man. This is what happens when good Angora goes bad. This is like the green vest that I showed you the other day. This is from the If I Knew Then What I Know Now file, I wouldn't have done what I'd done. So this is a yarn, and you can see from the fuzz on that, this is a high content Angora yarn. I cannot tell you how soft this is. This is unbelievably soft. This is a yarn that I picked up as remnant balls at the Knitters Factory shop, which is what the Skeins retail store was called before we rebranded it to Skeins, before they let me get involved. And I picked this up as remnants, and I did it. I mean, I was going through a bit of a purple phase at the time. It was purple, but also it was, seriously, I mean, like, this is so soft, so soft. I was pregnant with my first child, and I was placed, I was told that, as many of us are, I mean, I'm an older mum, so I got to a point in the pregnancy where I got from the midwife and said, right, well, you can do what you're doing in the morning, but from lunchtime, you're butt in a chair, feet up. You need to, look after yourself, look after its baby, blood pressure, so on and so forth. And if you caught up with my story earlier in the diaries, you'll understand why looking after this wee bub was incredibly important to us. So that's when I was like, thank God I'm a knitter, because it's like I need to do a lot of knitting. So this pattern was out of a Claire Keaton book, and I thought, I'm going to knit this up in a sweater for me. So this is what I knit, and it was just wonderful, except the pilling was horrific. Now, I've actually just recently given this quite a big depill, so it's not looking too bad. But as you can see, because the colour actually changes, as you can see, there's been quite a bit of shearing that's going on with the Angora there. And actually around the front, there's a bit of pilling there. You can see around the front. Can you see it? It's all fluffy, and oh my Lord. And there's bits missing from there, and I've had to depill it out because I didn't realise how much, honestly, every time I wore this, I looked like the abominable snowman. It was the worst case of garment selection for yarn known to man. It was dreadful. The good news about this sweater is that it's so comforting to wear. And yes, I do still wear this. And it is the garment that I pull out in the nastiest, coldest winter days, because I live here in Hawke's Bay. We don't get super cold days. But every now and then you'll get one or two in a winter where it is utterly miserable outside, sort of rain bordering on sleet, and it's horrifically cold. You do not want to go anywhere except stay at home and knit and have baking and hot chocolates. This is that jumper. So it still has a purpose, but as you can see, it is certainly one that has required, as you can see there on the sleeve, pretty aggressive depilling just to even keep it remotely stable. So that is that. Now, where did I get to before I got, so I've covered, so I've covered off construction, I've covered off twist, covered off fine premium fibres, but what about the fibres that live at this end of the spectrum? What about them? Well, here's the good news about those fibres. You may not have the lovely, beautiful, purable softness that you get with these. These are definitely more rustic yarns. This one here is that I pulled out, and I've lost the ball band already. I think is a Faranese one. This is from the Faroe Islands. I'll find that. Slack twisted. I've never been to the Faroes, but I've got good friends that have spent a bit of time up there. And the reality of it is it's a harsh environment. To live in a harsh environment, you create a harsh fibre, and you get a really rustic yarn. There is nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that whatsoever. So that is where yarns like Southlander really come into play, because what they do is when you have a more rustic yarn, they have a tendency to actually wear so much better, and you don't get a lot of that pilling because there is not as many fibres that make up the thickness of that strand. They tend not to jump out and want to play. So if you're wanting a yarn that will actually give you really good wearability and won't pill, that's when the more rustic yarns are absolutely fantastic. Not necessarily a yarn that we want to wear around here, but in terms of outerwear, if you're looking for a garment for outerwear, a garment that you'll throw on to go out and walk the dog, a garment that you will put on with a wider neck on a toddler and they're going to go to daycare and rough and tumble and do everything that you can imagine that they can do. This is where these yarns work incredibly well. Patterning. I knitted 1,000,001 Milo vests. The Milo vest I know is one of the ones that people have gone and popped over into the favourite thread of patterns, go-to pattern favourites in the Skein Speakeasy, and I know people have put Milo in there. Milo was my go-to for my guys, absolutely. And what was brilliant about Milo is that it's a square sort of little sort of strappy, very wide neck little vest, which meant that you generally had a merino or a t-shirt or something else underneath next to the skin, so you could put these more rustic outer layer garments in them, and it didn't bother them because it wasn't being worn against the skin. And I did it, and I mean, I've got a very sensitive, my oldest boy has got sensory processing disorder, so he's incredibly sensitive, but he was able to wear, I was able to get him into even vintage. Was a great one for him because smooth construction. Most of his stuff, in fact, was knitted in vintage as a kid because it had that perfect balance between a yarn that gave me good stitch definition, smoothness, wear, didn't pill too badly. It was kind of like this brilliant middle of the road yarn, and that was one that I used all the time. And Southlander, if pilling is something you utterly detest, you can't go past Southlander. It really is fantastic. Now, home spinning is also another way, and the home spinners in the group will understand this, and I've pulled this out because this I think will be a really good example. I'm somebody that likes higher twists, so a lot of my homespun yarns are spun with a higher angle of twist. It's a personal preference thing. Some hand spinners choose not to do that. I do. It's just me. So I spun this a number of years ago. Can you see that there? So the rainbow stuff is merino, shrink treated merino, 22 micron.